now? Okay, so we're now recording. This is the Cataloging Zarr Stores breakout room of the ESIP session. The saga continues for ESIP Summer 2021. My name's Charles Stern. I'm a data infrastructure engineer with Lamont Doherty Earth Observatory and working on Pangeo Forge. This is really just an opportunity to discuss how everyone feels about choices for cataloging Zarr stores with STAC specification. I'm really actually here just to be a listener and learn from everyone else's perspectives. I have not actually started doing any of this cataloging yet myself, but it's imminent, and so I'm very interested to hear everyone's perspectives. I've been following along as Tom, who's here with us today, has been sharing his experiences on the Pangeo discourse. And so maybe we'll hear from him as well. I'll just frame briefly and then maybe have everyone else just jump in if you want to raise your hand or just jump in with your perspective. My understanding as the kind of like general frame for the conversation is that Zarr stores don't necessarily fit the standard spatiotemporal asset catalog or STAC model as maybe it was initially conceived, because Zarr stores are directories, for those who are not familiar, that contain a large number of subfiles, but none of those files have any meaning or metadata independent of the whole directory. So that does make them quite different than, let's say, a collection of cloud optimized geotiffs where a certain sensor will have collected a large range of cogs that all have their own metadata. So they have a little bit of a different fit to STAC, but we're still interested in using STAC because of all the momentum and tools around that. And that's the basic questions is, how do you categorize a Zarr store? Is a Zarr store sort of the lowest level of a STAC item? Is it what would be called a collection level asset? And those are some of the framing questions. And I guess I'll just pause there because I want to just listen and hear everyone's perspective. And if you want to raise your hand, you can, but you'd also maybe just jump in with your perspective. And Tom, if it's not too bold to just call on you, I guess I'll say you've had a lot that I've learned from on this. So I don't know if you have anything to add to my introduction there.
Yeah, not much. It's kind of all laid out in that discourse post, my best current understanding. So yeah, I'm just, if anyone has questions, I'm really curious to hear thoughts about that. In particular, I think it's worth diving into use cases for metadata. So taking like the cloud optimized geotiff, if you've seen the STAC library, that makes it really easy to work with a ton of cloud optimized geotiffs using libraries like Dask in parallel, just because it removes the cost of opening each cog, which is a lot of overhead. Anyway, it can be a lot of overhead. With something like Zarr, we already have X-ray and Zarr. There's not so much overhead, especially with consolidated metadata. So like that use case of a bunch of really large data sets is kind of already handled. So I'm curious to hear about other use cases that people are interested in using the metadata for.
So I'm not particularly new to Zarr or STAC, but I'm kind of new to this framing of the problem. And I'm trying to understand a little better. What would the two options be in kind of concrete terms? Is it that a single Zarr store would be a single STAC item, even if it contains multiple variables and those kinds of things, versus each variable within a Zarr store would be its own STAC item in a larger catalog? But then I assume there would still be, even each variable in a Zarr store could correspond to many files, right? So, one for each chunk or various metadata files. And I assume those would still all be grouped together in that STAC item. Am I saying that right?
Yeah, I think so. Like that's one of the things we're bumping up against. So for us, this is, I just put in the chat the stack item, or sorry, the stack collection that we made for Terra Climate. And in that we chose to use a single collection. And if you look at the assets, that's where you'll find the link to the Zarr root. And so we don't have any stack items here. And then all of the variables are in that stack collection using the data cube extension, which you can use to describe more than one variable. And then our use case was generating an HTML catalog page. So I'll put that link as soon as I find it here. And then other groups like the CMIP6 group, ESGF, is that right? Are looking at using stack items for Zarr data sets. Again, same idea though, all the variables, it'd be an asset on the item rather than the collection, but all the variables would be there.
So I guess a couple different facets of this, at least from my perspective, are, first of all, I guess it's not necessarily the case that a Zarr, I call them variables. I don't remember the word in Zarr parlance if it's a data set, but you know, the child arrays inside of a single Zarr store. It's not necessarily the case that the overall Zarr store is going to be separate files, right? Because they do support backends that are, for instance, zip or you know, multiple backends. I guess in the normal cloud optimized case, it would be that you would be storing each individual chunk and all the metadata files in separate objects, but it's not necessarily true, right?
That's an interesting point, Patrick. I've always, you know, in my relatively, admittedly, new exposure to Zarr, I've always experienced it as this cloud optimized format, but this notion of additional backends is a good one to be aware of. Yeah. I suppose for cataloging in this setting, I'm imagining the cloud optimized format, but it's good to be aware of where these edge cases exist. I did want to call on, and we can come back to that, but I did want to call on Ted, because Ted, you had raised your hand a little while back.
Yeah, thanks, Charles. I just wanted to clarify something here. The stack metadata is considered to be completely different than the Zarr sort of chunk location, whether it's chunked in files or zips or in separate objects. The stack metadata is focused really on just spatial temporal discovery of these things, right?
That's my understanding. Yes. So in this kind of schema that we're talking about, the Zarr store would have its own Zarr metadata or .z metadata file that describes sort of its internal characteristics, and then the stack item, which would be or collection or whatever the stack object would be a JSON file that conforms to that specification, that then allows you to sort of navigate to where that Zarr store is and open its metadata to get to that next deeper level. That's how I've been thinking of it.
Right, because you know, so it's sort of interesting. I mean, there is some overlap in terms of these, you know, the chunks that are in, say, a multi-dimensional data set. Those chunks also have spatial temporal characteristics, but it's basically the Zarr library that's doing that, you know, searching those things if you select a region of interest, which involves multiple times. So there's sort of like two levels of possible spatial temporal searching going on here.
Yeah, and
sorry, go ahead, Charles.
Oh, sorry, go ahead, Rob. Yeah.
Oh no, sorry. I was just going to say, I think, Ted, that's one of the open questions that we're trying to get a better handle on or ascertain, is for the wider user community. For people that are doing dimensional search, normally people would look at an open Zarr archive and see what the dimensions associated with that archive are, the dimension ranges and granularity for those dimensions. And we're trying to get a handle on if we were to package some of that higher level dimensional information into STAC records, if that would be valuable for people to search on. For instance, are people trying to search for things that have a temperature dimension? Are people trying to search for things that have a variable height dimension? So we want to know, I think when people are searching for Zarr archives at a higher level using some metadata search utility, do they want to be able to understand the Zarr's internal dimensional structure?
Or take advantage of that internal dimensional structure in the STAC level search rather than the Zarr level search.
Yeah, exactly. I think what Tom's illustrating with, I don't know if he's linked to, sorry, I don't know if he's linked to the X-ray assets portion here, but as far as data level access goes, I think the paradigm is that we'll be handling all that, or all that will be handled at the Zarr level. Like when you're trying to request chunks from a specific Zarr archive, that's all handled by your Zarr subsetting itself. But when people are trying to find which Zarr archives they should be using and what Zarr archives they have interest in, especially in a large catalog of data sets, how do we expose the internal dimensional information and what's contained in those Zarr archives, and what level of search do we need support for those things?
This is a very interesting point, and I'm so glad we're having this conversation, because these are the exact kind of things that we should be thinking about. Why don't we call on JF, because you've raised your hand, and let's hear your perspective.
Great. Yes, thanks. I'm Jeff. And we're doing, I think, something slightly different with our Zarr. We're using intake ESM, which for reasons I don't quite understand, the developer saying he has a hard time making it truly STAC compliant. But what we've been doing, can I share my screen for just 1 second here?
Yeah, sure. Let's see.
Let's see, where's the correct, this one here. Can you see this thing? It should say CESM1 lens data.
Yes, we do see that. Yeah.
Great. So this is just some model outputs, and this table here actually represents what's in our intake ESM catalog. Originally, it was very bare bones, like the columns were the minimum number of columns to distinguish the Zarr stores from each other. So like each Zarr store had one variable with some cryptic name, and then it was either atmosphere or ocean. It might be a model run from the past versus a model run from the future. It might be daily, it might be monthly. And that was it. And then we just had the path. And what we've started doing, the path being the actual S3 location of the Zarr store, which for some reason I can't scroll to anymore. Oh, there we go. Yeah, at the end. Now we're starting to augment that. So instead of just the short variable name, we're adding also the long name, which is defined by the modeling project. We want to add another column, which would be the CF standard name. So you could find, for example, from any modeling project, any variables that correspond to that standard CF name. And we started adding things like, how many vertical levels it has, what's the domain? We didn't put the coordinates, but those global versus not global, units, start time and end time. So I don't know, I just wanted to mention this. It's been useful to us so that people could find, which Zarr store they want, or set of Zarr stores, distinguish between multiple Zarr stores for a single variable, because they might have, different time ranges or different other attributes. Again, I don't quite know why the difference between this and STAC, except to say that Anderson, our main developer on this, says, there's some sort of incompatibility that makes it not work. I don't know if we could use STAC as well to do some other aspect of discovery, maybe pointing to this intake ESM. Anyway.
Jeff, what are you storing that meta information in? How's that?
Like essentially the contents of this table, where does that come from?
Yes.
It comes from a collection description file, first of all, which is this little bit of JSON. And then which points to this CSV file. Well, probably if I do that, it's going to try to download or whatever. So yeah, I can give you the, anyways, that's where it's stored. Is that enough of an answer?
Yep.
Okay. And just for complete, I'll stop sharing my screen, but I'll also put the address of that page we were just looking at in the chat. If I can get back to Zoom. And, yeah.
Yes, please.
So,
go ahead.
So quick, I'm trying to keep the, I don't have a program for this. I'm trying to keep the players in place. So could someone say something about sort of differences, similarities between intake and STAC? I thought that they were sort of tightly linked to one another. And Jeff, in this case, ESM means Earth System Model?
Yes. So it's focused on, climate models, but I think a lot of concepts could be used for non-model output.
Yeah, so relationship between intake and STAC?
Yeah, so first of all, Patrick, I'm just noting that I know that your hand is raised, so we'll get to you as soon as we address this question. Would someone else, is there someone who feels confident in giving Ted an answer on their understanding of the difference between intake and STAC beyond what I would say is that STAC is its own specific specification, whereas intake is a sort of user interface for accessing different types of catalogs. And I haven't specifically used intake ESM, which I believe is sort of a subset of intake, but someone may want to correct me on that understanding.
Yeah, that's basically right. So intake and STAC they do overlap a bit because intake has its own catalog format, but they're also compatible because intake can be extended to understand any catalog format. So that's where the intake STAC library comes in, which lets you load in a STAC catalog into intake and then do the usual intake things like load up an item as a data array.
And Patrick, let me just add one follow-up if I can. So understanding a catalog is a mapping between some set of intake metadata elements and the representation of those elements in some other catalog thing.
Yeah, essentially some logic for if I select this key, what does that map to in the other catalog? So in the intake STAC example, it's you select the ID of an asset or a child item.
Mm-hmm. And can those catalogs be JSON or YAML or XML?
Intake catalogs, yes.
Cool. Thanks.
And Micah has put in the chat, we need a relationship diagram to map these out. Yeah, that would probably be very helpful. Maybe that will be one of our takeaways. So we have about 4 minutes before we need to present our 3 takeaways. Okay, Tom, good to see you. Thanks for joining. Patrick, let's hear from you. So you have your hand raised for a while.
Yeah, I've already talked plenty probably, so thanks for calling on me again. Just to try to at least give some answer in terms of how I've seen things done on the NASA EOSDIS side of things. It seems like we kind of want both is maybe what this is coming down to, at least how I think of things. That people are often looking for a particular science variable within a broader data set that has a lot of ancillary quality information, or even like coordinate information. And then, but it is important to have sort of the cross navigability between those two things, which, and so for the first thing, it seems like you would want your things separated out by catalog, but you still, for the second thing, being able to get to, here's the quality information for this thing that you just asked, or here's another coincident variable for what you just asked for. You'd want it all probably in the stack item. So I think the relationship diagram seems to be a good place to start. And I think it's possible that we might find that what we want is to figure out a way to, you know, have the right kinds of cross linkings so that we're not paying the penalty of a trade-off as much as we might otherwise be.
Thanks for that, Patrick. And I obviously there's a number of ongoing follow-ups, and I'm so glad to see that this was a topic that resonated with everybody. Maybe I have my own bias as having started here, but I would encourage, if everyone would be interested, to continue the conversation on the Pangeo discourse link, which is in the subgroup discussion, under the subgroup discussion bullets in our Saga Continues agenda document. That has had a lot of ongoing contributions, particularly from Tom, who was just here. And if that's not the venue you want to discuss it, then maybe you could even just drop in and say, hey, I'd rather discuss over here, and provide a link to some other thread. But I think these are great things to stay in touch about. We have 2 more minutes. And so Rob, as our sort of note taker, do you feel like you have a good sense of our 3 takeaways that we want to share with the broader group momentarily?
Well, one that kind of came right out at the end was we want to develop a relationship diagram that would link attributes and variables from a STAC catalog to Zarr stores. Does that sound right?
Patrick, is that how you imagine that relationship diagram being, or is it mapping something else to something else?
I think the relationship diagram could help kind of frame the discussion and maybe figure things out a little bit better. So, yeah.
So I think, because I think we're actually going to be kicked out of this room in about 30 seconds. I guess I'm sorry. I'll just sort of say, Rob, I think that is a good point, and maybe the higher level point than that I would add is just a broader way of defining all the different terminology here, so that everyone who's coming from different perspectives, whether it's on intake and stack down to the internals of variable names, there needs to be a lot more visibility to these things. Is one point. And another point that well, maybe that's even just the